Well, welcome to The Check-In, a podcast by the Telos Group on the Telos channel. For those who are joining us for the first time, the Telos Group is an American nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to form communities of peacemakers across lines of difference and equip them to help reconcile seemingly intractable conflict at home and abroad. We've been doing this work for nearly 15 years, bringing thousands of Americans to the region to understand how to become peacemakers, not only in their own lives and communities, but also on behalf of both Israelis and Palestinians. This is our podcast, The Check-In, a semi-regular conversation where we dive deep into the headlines from Israel and Palestine and across the world, where we wade into the complexity of seemingly intractable conflict to discover the power of peacemaking to heal us, our community, and our world. I am your host, David Cadabot, checking in from Washington, D.C. today. We are grateful that you're joining us. We have a number of folks from our team here to have this conversation today. And before we get started, I just want to note that none of our team from the ground in Israel-Palestine are on this call with us today. And that's because they need the time and space to first and foremost be okay, to take care of their families and communities, and be fully present where they are. We have been in close contact and communication with them. They are all okay and safe, and they've contributed to what we're going to be talking about today. But we wanted to acknowledge that normally we would not have a conversation like this without them present. But these are extenuating circumstances, and their families and well-being come first. But we do have some pretty amazing folks on this call from the Telos team that I am excited for you all to hear from. Many of you have met these folks. I'm going to give them a chance to check in as we get started here. And I'll start with Sarah. Where are you checking in from?
From DC as well.
Dave, where are you checking in from?
Yeah, I happen to be in DC as well today.
Carolyn, where are you checking in from?
Another DC.
And if you haven't guessed by the backgrounds, Todd, where are you checking in from?
I'm also in the DC office.
Greg, we're glad you're here. Where are you checking in from?
I'm at home in New York City.
Well, folks, we are eager to have this conversation with you all today. I also want to flag that you can leave your questions in the chat function of this call. We will see them, and we'll leave about 20 minutes at the end of this conversation to answer your questions. So please feel free to add them into the chat there. We all know why we are here today. All of us are aching and grieving on this team. Before we dive into some analysis and answer your questions, I just want to catch us up and make sure we all know what has happened this weekend and why we feel it is so important for us as peacemakers to lean in right now. On Saturday, Hamas launched a surprise attack on Israel, which included thousands of rockets, armed militias breaching the fence, fighting in southern Israeli communities. As of today, I've seen numbers saying more than 1,000 Israelis have been killed in this attack, men, women, and children. Dozens taken hostage and thousands more wounded. In response, Israel began its airstrikes on Gaza. Hundreds killed, thousands wounded. All of this on the weekend of the 50th anniversary of the Yom Kippur War, one of the bloodiest wars in Israeli history. Then, the past 2 days, we've seen more violence. The bombardment of Gaza has continued. Entire residential buildings have been leveled, with hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced. The death toll continues to climb within Israel, and fighting has ensued in a number of Israeli villages near the border. The IDF has yet to gain control. Families are waiting to hear from missing loved ones. Folks, as a team, we are so deeply grieved by this news. We mourn the hundreds of Israelis who were brutally killed, many in their own homes. For the family members who have lost loved ones and whose loved ones remain missing. The grief and fear of this moment, this weekend was the deadliest day for the Jewish diaspora since the Holocaust. It is simply impossible to overstate. And as a team, we want to preface up front that we absolutely reject any notion that terrorism, violence against civilians, is a legitimate form of resistance. And we reject that violence and subjugation will enable a lasting security. You see, violence cannot lead to justice, and justice is indispensable from peace. As such, we grieve the hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza, many of whom are under 18 years old, who are children, who have nothing to do with Hamas or its leadership, and who have already been killed. Many of whom are now homeless and who must live within an open-air prison, who have nowhere to go and no protection from the bombs now raining down on their homes. As peacemakers, we must ask, is there a way out? Is there anything we can do? How do we hold the tension to see the humanity of all in this moment, to recognize the horror and egregious evil of terror, and demand an end to unjust siege, which has pushed Gazans to a point of utter despair and death? But to move forward, we want to name, we don't fully understand the extent of everything that has already happened, but we do know this, that sadly, it's going to get much darker before it gets better. But we're here to lean in as peacemakers. We need to explore the deeper questions today of how we got here and where we go from here, so we minimize human suffering in the future. We cannot afford to repeat the very mistakes that have brought us here in the first place. In fact, we believe there was a way to claim our agency and responsibility to be a part of the transformation of this violence into the possibility of flourishing for all. So that's why we're here today. We're inviting you all to join us in that work, the difficult work of holding on to this vision of mutual flourishing. We are grateful you all are here. Todd, I want to start with you. We want to begin this conversation by centering in on the humanity of all those who are impacted and involved. What we're about to talk about, as we offer some analysis, if we don't do that centered with humanity, we can actually do more harm than good. So, Todd, I want to hear, do you have updates from our partners in the region, many of whom the folks on this call have met and who love and know? Can you provide us some updates?
Sure. That's such an important place to start, David. When Greg and I started Telos 15 years ago, it was very much centered on these notions of universal human dignity, the sacredness of all human life, and the interconnectedness of that we all have as human beings. And at Telos, we are really tethered to the horror of all this in a very particular and somewhat unique way because of that, because we have deep relationships with Palestinians and with Israelis. And I think most of us here at Telos have been in communication with our Israeli and Palestinian partners and friends over the last several days. A lot of folks who've been exposed to our work and have been on our trips have asked us about particular people. But over and over again, people have asked us about our friend Roni Kedar, who lives in the Israeli town of Nativ HaSarah on the border of the Gaza Strip. She's an amazing peace activist. She's safe, but I think it's fair to say that she's deeply traumatized, as 15 of her neighbors were killed last Saturday morning. So it's a really heavy time for all of us here as we see what has happened and what is continuing to unfold and the way it's impacting our these deep and dear friends that we have in so many places throughout the land.
Thanks, Todd. I know many of our friends were quite worried for Roni, and we're glad to hear that she's safe. And we know that the trauma of this weekend is not insignificant. In fact, will be likely lasting for a very long time, in part because what happened this weekend was very significant. In some ways, this could be a turning point for the region. Greg, I want to draw you in and ask you to help us understand how this moment why this moment is not a normal escalation. Can you give us some context for the bigger realities around why this is such a significant event that happened this weekend?
Look, this moment is different from any other moment that I've seen in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. For new friends joining us, I am American of Palestinian descent. I have huge family living on the ground. They have been dealt, in my view, a terrible hand for their lives and their livelihoods and the conditions that they were born into. And I think it just got much worse. What makes this moment different, this for Israel was the most significant amount of conflict that Israel has experienced in at least 50 years, the most deaths on a single day. Israelis were and are suffering in extraordinary ways that they had never anticipated. It was a surprise attack. There's so many ways that we can actually say that this moment is different, but there are also the geopolitical aspects of this, which I hate to bring in, but are equally important. I think there's one of the reasons why Israel-Palestine has persisted as an issue for over a century is because it's never just been about Israelis and Palestinians. There's been a lot of outside forces throughout the world. Originally, it was the British and the French Empire as they divvied up the Middle East after the fall of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Now we have Americans involved. We have Iran, Saudi, Russia, China, all of these geopolitical actors. And what's particularly scary about this moment, aside from the extraordinary loss of life for Israelis and now for Palestinians that we're seeing in Gaza, is it feels that we are moving into a new era of this horrific issue, and that could extend regionally and have implications much more broadly. To put it very simply, this feels like a 9/11 moment. In a sense, it's a before and after moment. And so not to put the human suffering to the side, which we have to consistently center, but this is a forever changed dialogue around Israel-Palestine, at least for the next decade, the broader Middle East. And so I think we do have to pay particular attention now. Many choices are being made today in terms of policy and posture and analysis that will have impact for millions of people for years to come.
And we're going to pick up that question, Greg, later on in this conversation. How do we work through what those policies and reactions are? How do we lean in as peacemakers in this moment in response to everything that's happened? But Sarah, I want to ask you, there's so much grief right now across the board, as there should be. There's been a lot of loss this weekend. How are you holding it all together? How are you responding? And what does grief look like right now?
Yeah, I think grief is the overwhelming emotion and word to categorize this weekend for so many people. Grief, fear, anger, hopelessness. Watching Israeli peacemaker friends mourn the loss of other friends and peacemakers. Watching them have to go through, right, being attacked from both sides. And watching Palestinian friends and colleagues in Gaza and the West Bank, right, worry for themselves, be deeply grieved about what's happening. I don't think the grief can be overstated, and I also don't think it should be overlooked. We talk about peace as being not a zero-sum game, right? We're trying to move away from that mentality. Justice cannot be zero-sum. Flourishing cannot be zero-sum. But I also think grief cannot be zero-sum. And what I've been seeing, across the internet and so many communities is that this idea of either we get to grieve or you get to grieve. And I think in this moment, our grief is an invitation to also think about how it's not zero-sum. It's so easy to let that grief and fear catalyze and crystallize into anger and hatred, into that oppositional binary of us versus them. But as I've been sitting in my deep grief this weekend for my Israeli Jewish friends, for my Palestinian friends, for the immense loss of life, trauma, and suffering across Israel this weekend, and the immense loss of life, trauma, and suffering across Gaza, I'm reminded that my grief is also because I love. And it doesn't just come from a place of anger, fear, and hatred, but it's because I deeply, deeply love my Jewish Israeli friends and my Palestinian friends. And I think in this moment, there is an invitation for all of us to remember that our grief comes from that place of love. And love is also not zero-sum. There's a lot of false equivalency. There's a lot of, right, continued binary thinking. But I think in this moment, as we engage the rest of this conversation, as we engage the narratives we're hearing, to remember that we can sit in that grief with Israelis and with Palestinians, because we love Israelis and Palestinians, because we have a vision and a hope that there is a possibility for a better future where everyone flourish. It's not a positive emotion right now. It's not a productive emotion right now, but it's one that to me has been really helpful in resisting that binary thinking, resisting the hopelessness. And I invite you all to try and have your grief come from a place of love rather than anger, fear, or hatred.
Sarah, I so appreciate what you're saying right now, that our grief isn't zero-sum, our love isn't zero-sum, and that it's actually really essential to sit in that grief, because if we move too quickly to how do we respond, that it won't be out of a place of love, right? It'll be out of a place of fear. and anger, and in so many ways that can devolve into a kind of violence. So thank you for the invitation you're offering us, and I'd encourage all of us who are listening to let ourselves experience that grief, to lament together, personally, within your community, whatever it looks like for you. That being said, we also know that a peacemaker responds by leaning in, by getting curious, right? As you're saying, we refuse to simplify into dehumanizing binaries, and we open space for not only justice, but also healing and repair. And to do that, we have to get curious. So I'm going to move us into a time of asking some critical questions. How did we get here? What's in the larger context that we need? And before we get any further, Greg, I'm going to ask you to help us understand who even is Hamas, and how has the Israeli government engaged with this organization, this militant group, historically? How did we get here today, this weekend?
That's a big question, David. But the short version of it is Hamas is an Islamic movement within Palestinian society. They are a movement that has dealt with humanitarian issues, and they've also dealt with political issues. They are characterized as a terrorist organization by many countries, most countries around the world. If you have a memory of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from the so-called Second Intifada, Palestinian uprising, through a variety of suicide bombings against Israeli civilian targets, which were primarily executed by Hamas. Hamas is a rival to, it's the main rival to Fatah, the largest Palestinian party that was founded and associated with Yasser Arafat. And today, Hamas controls the Gaza Strip and Fatah controls the West Bank. Some larger context here, you asked how has Israel dealt with Hamas? And this is a huge question that we can get into on another conversation because this is complex. But Israel, the Gaza Strip, which borders the Mediterranean Sea, the West Bank, which borders the Jordan River, and Jordan, all of these territories ultimately are under control of the Israeli military. People, goods, water, services don't get in or out of these territories without, at least theoretically, the eyes and of the Israeli military. Gaza, of course, has some tunnels going in, which is how these missiles came in. But historically, early on, when Hamas was founded in the 80s, primarily as a social movement, many in Israel saw it as a counterbalance to the PLO, Fatah, and Yasser Arafat. And so early on, Israel supported Hamas as this alternate Palestinian movement. That support obviously changed as Hamas grew and evolved. But even today, today's Israeli finance minister Smotrich, previously called Hamas a strategic asset for Israel, in the sense that if you had Hamas in control of Gaza and the West Bank under Fatah, what you had was the prevention of the development of a larger Palestinian state. So I think there is a lot of important context to dive into here. When I talked about the 9/11 moment earlier, I think we're going to come back to that. I don't want to cast that in the same way, but I want to say the significance of this cannot be overstated, cannot be understated. And what happened after 9/11 is we made a lot of choices. We sacrificed thousands of American lives. Many estimate millions of deaths throughout the Middle East and Northern Africa in the wars that ensued. We spent trillions of dollars. And now the Taliban is back in charge of Afghanistan. So whatever your analysis is the choices that we made post 9/11 didn't make the world a safer place. And in fact, they may have had the opposite results. And so I think it's particularly important for us as peacemakers right now to lean into these conversations and to say that if we are working towards a mutual flourishing of all people, of all Israelis and all Palestinians, if we root that work in fundamental human rights that cannot countenance terrorism committed by anyone, that cannot countenance violence committed against civilians, we really have to be careful in understanding where we locate ourselves, where we sit ourselves, and how we respond. What are we working towards? Are we working in a way that will entrench conflict, that will entrench these realities, or are we working in a way that might actually have the hope of leading everyone to a safer, more just future?
I appreciate that historical background, Greg, catching us up to speed. I also want to ask you uh, to clarify the distinction between the Palestinian people and then Hamas as an Islamist movement. What is life like for an average Gazan? And what does it have to do with the conversation we're having today?
Well, I have not been to Gaza in many years myself, personally. I think, if you think of Fatah and Hamas, for Palestinians, these are the main political parties. Palestinians are divided in their leadership. I think your average Palestinian feels abandoned by every political party, by the entire world. I think what we saw on Saturday was reprehensible and unjustifiable, and there is nothing that can ever justify the attacks that we saw. And yet for Palestinians living in Gaza or elsewhere, they have experienced unjustifiable acts, crimes against humanity for many decades that often go unnoticed and unremarked. For Palestinians in Gaza, they have lived at least these last 16 years under an almost absolute siege. And that means that they've had restrictions on water, goods, food, all sorts of supplies, and meanwhile have been regularly bombarded. You have 50% of the population in the Gaza Strip that is under the age of 19. We can go down through these litany of things, and I think it would be worth it to have a deep dive in Gaza some point soon. The one thing that I do want to put out here, which may sound a little bit controversial, though, is that these attacks were a complete surprise. And yet the situation that we're seeing today was not only predictable, but it was predicted for many years. And it was preventable. And so what I mean by that, if you go back to this period just before the closure, when Israel pulled out its settlements, its settlers, its Jewish-only communities from the Gaza Strip, as well as its permanent military bases, you will see historic world figures from Israel and from the West prognosticating what would happen to Gaza if it weren't allowed to breathe and interact with the world. Instead, what Gaza saw is a closure of its borders, its land, its air, its sea space. And what we're seeing today, sadly, was both predicted and preventable. And that's important to name in this moment as we are making these choices about how we respond in these moments. If this was predictable and preventable, we have to come back to our moments of sobriety when we understood that so many of the policies around the closure of the Gaza Strip didn't just harm Gazans, but actually made some kind of conflagration inevitable at some point in the future. And that was stated from everyone from Condoleezza Rice to George Bush to Tony Blair. This is all part of the historical record, as well as Israel's own security establishment, the Shin Bet.
I think, Greg, what you're inviting us into is this invitation to see the bigger picture, right? But also to recognize the way in which a kind of security that exists off of the deprivation of human rights and other people is not lasting. It's not secure. And so I want to draw in Todd next to help us also orient this conversation from the U.S. angle. How has the U.S. responded to the events of this past weekend? For those of us who are American citizens listening to this call, I think that's a really essential part to pay attention to. Todd, catch us up.
Yeah, I think as Greg said earlier, this for many Americans, this is seen as a version of what happened here on 9/11. And so there's been a very post 9/11 outpouring of support. There are, of course, enormous differences between the two, but in terms of how Americans are responding, I think that's the right comparison. There's been an overwhelming and bipartisan response in support of Israel, and a rush to ensure that Israel has whatever the U.S. can provide as it makes its own military response to what happened. And that response has begun already with a massive bombing campaign of the Gaza Strip, where the civilian death toll is mounting, and that is expected to continue for some time. It may ultimately be accompanied by a ground campaign. It's not sure yet, but the support for that is pretty wide and bipartisan and across the board in the United States. What I would love to see is a U.S. response that widened the aperture and that was consistent in its regard for human life and its concern for civilian casualties, um, and a response that understood the way to achieve peace and stability has to be rooted in respect for human dignity and human life and concern for justice. And the answer to the brutality of Saturday's attack on men and women and children in the south of Israel is not the killing of thousands of Palestinian civilians, men and women and children in Gaza. Because if we study history and we believe that there is in some way a moral universe, violence begets violence, and the killing of civilians is morally wrong across the board. And it's also self-defeating. It creates entire new generations of those left behind who demand revenge. And it can feel uncomfortable to hold these sort of different truths in tension, but the central truth that we're holding together is that the killing of civilians in different ways, but is undermining of the desire for peace and security that people want and deserve to live with, and it's not justified. What happened on Saturday is incredibly horrific and not justified. And the response to that, if it is the slaughter of men, women, and children in Gaza in a massive and indiscriminate bombing campaign, is also not a justified thing.
Appreciate you naming how violence begets violence, and that just because someone committed a war crime against you does not give you a justification to commit war crimes yourself, right? That the violence, that the resistance built on violence is as much self-destruction as it is a kind of liberation, or that it actually is just asking for a return of violence. I think that vision of something more, that there's a different way out of this, that it is possible to pursue the flourishing of both Israelis and Palestinians, not giving into these simple binaries of us versus them, of if I can get what I need, it has to come at the expense of my neighbor. I think that's so important right now. And I want to transition our conversation to what does it look like to do the work of peacemaking in this moment? How can each of us be peacemakers? How do we respond in the way that we talk to our community, in the way that we engage on social media, the way we advocate even? I think that's, people are searching for ways to respond right now. I want to start, Todd, actually coming back to you with a question that also came up in the chat in some ways, of how do we sensitively and hopefully offer the context that goes beyond these simple binaries of those are the enemy, they're not human, they deserve to be vanquished at any cost, right? How do we avoid those binaries and at the same time thoughtfully and sensitively offer context to the bigger picture? Or even when isn't it appropriate to respond getting to the bigger picture at all? I think that's a tension that many of us feel right now.
Well, I want to start. I just want to go back and finish one thought that I didn't put out there as a prelude to answering that important question, which is that the phrase that keeps coming into my mind is not like this. And when I think of, Israel has the right to defend itself, and the people who live in the south of Israel have the right to be safe in their own homes, and the Palestinians who live in the Gaza Strip have the right to live without occupation and control and blockade, and should be able to move freely and interact with the outside world. And all these things are true, and to achieve them, it doesn't happen like this. And that's where I think, the work of peacemaking offers these keen insights about what are the questions we need to be asking, and then what is the work we need to do, and how do we do that. But I also think as we've stated too many times already, maybe in this conversation, this feels very post 9/11, and we need to remember that people are, many are in a state of shock and grief and anger right now, and it's hard in that moment to really even open ourselves up to the questions that we need to ask and the nuance that's required. And as we look back as Americans on our own response to 9/11 20 years later, we have we have the ability to see, what questions did we ask ourselves, and then ask what we accomplished with the forever wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so those are important questions now, and there was definitely context then that we may appreciate now that we weren't open to at the time. And so the more we can open ourselves up to that and asking those hard questions, the more likely we are to channel the grief and the anger and the rage that we feel into constructive things that might help us sort out some of these very difficult things. But it's a difficult thing to ask people in a time of heightened emotion, and a time right now where war has begun, but we're in the middle of it. What does it really look like to ask those kind of questions?
I think it's important to sort of set our expectations for this moment and also for this work. And what I mean by that is that we may not see the fruits of this labor for some time, and that's going to be devastating and particularly difficult. But this is true throughout history. Abolitionists fighting for the end of slavery, even before our Constitution was ratified, felt like they were fighting a futile fight, and it was in many senses futile at that particular time. But without their sacrifice and without their work, the movements that finally succeeded in dismantling slavery would not have been successful. I'm not making a strict analogy here. I want to be clear about that. But I think it's important for us to understand how important it is to do this work, the work of peacemaking. Second, I think you're going to get it from all different perspectives. That doesn't mean you're not wrong, but it also, if you're not sort of getting called out, asked things by people, particularly in moments like these, it doesn't mean you're really saying anything. So I think, one thing to remember about peacemaking is that it's looking for mutual flourishing is not about both sidesism. We're actively confronting a real injustice. Something horrific happened in Israel on Saturday that should not have happened. And Palestinians have been living under a horrific reality that the world has largely turned a blind eye to. I mean, if you spend any time on the ground in Gaza, in the West Bank, and even parts of Israel, and see what Palestinians have endured, and children and elderly people on a daily basis, it is untenable. It's wrong. Two wrongs don't make a right. There's a line that we need to, a baseline. This is the whole basis of forget about morality for a second, but international law has a concept called jus cogens, which is the idea that there's some crimes for which there's no defense. Even in war, you can't just go and commit genocide or have your folks rape a lot of people and say, oh, well, we did it because this was related to some, military objective or whatever. And there is a rationale for some really, like killing people in war that is considered legal. But there are these jus cogens, these absolute prohibitions under international law, and they're there for a reason, to create a baseline that we should try and call and hold ourselves accountable to. And so in this moment, I would say, for many people, depending upon where we're located, I think continuing to learn, to take none of us on this call fully can appreciate the enormity of what's happening and how it will play out. There are ways to speak up when we do know how to speak up, but I think we need to do it with compassion. I've seen so many sides of my social media flip from one side to the other, and it's just like, I understand some of, Palestinians who are like, well, we've been suffering unjustified. We've been experiencing this every day. Now Israelis are experiencing this, but like, wait a second, nobody should ever experience this. What are we fighting for? What is it that we're fighting for if we say that what we've been experiencing can never be justified by what Israelis have experienced, the horrific crimes for decades, centuries, millennia against the Jewish people does not justify what's happened to Palestinians because it doesn't? What does that mean? And so I think calling people back into this space, helping them understand that the way the world is not the way that the world will always be, that change is the only constant that we know, and reminding our friends of fundamental truths that they know. There will be a time, maybe not today, but maybe a few days from now, a few weeks from now, when you can bring out all the statements of all the Israeli security officials when there weren't rockets flying or these horrific things happening, who were saying that like this is actually emboldening extremism. Like what do you think is going to happen locking 2 million people, civilians, up? That's going to happen. We're going to need to tell these stories that are critical and that remind us that what we're hearing as the answers to these horrible solutions have often actually made us less safe and at great human and financial cost. The way of peacemaking, as long as the road may be, is the only way that ultimately provides hope for all of us.
Absolutely. And I'm thinking, Greg, of how we got here, right? We've been investing in the status quo for a long time, believing that it was in a way a kind of peace when there was calm on the surface. And as we've seen that there was no peace, right? Dr. Martin Luther King says true peace is not merely the absence of tension, but the presence of justice. And until we are able to cast a vision for justice for all people in the region, where Israelis have security and don't have to live in fear of their own homes, where Palestinians have dignity and freedom to have agency over their own lives, there will not be a true peace, right? As long as we continue to invest in the machines of war and violence, we're going to continue getting the results of war and violence, right?
Right. And the one thing I just want to add right here, which is important, I don't mean to depress anybody, but this is important. The first step of any peacemaker, diplomat, anyone who's trying to like have a positive impact on the world is to see the world as it is, not to project. And right now, I think, look, this is a problem between Israelis and Palestinians, but it's fundamentally a larger geopolitical problem. And when you see things that feel like they don't make sense, like why are people acting against their interests? Terrible analogy, but an apt one. We've all seen friends who've dealt with horrible addiction issues or gone from one abusive relationship to the other. Geopolitics is like slightly similar, that sometimes when systems seem broken, maybe they're not. Maybe they're actually working. Maybe there are people who are benefiting from this. And so I think we as peacemakers need to dial up our analytical tools to understand why things like this get entrenched, from an analysis of power, from some people benefiting from this status quo, even if they've been yelling and decrying it because it's just so wrong. And then how can we be sophisticated to challenge those underlying rationales and to call that out in increasingly sophisticated ways? I see people talking about American diplomacy in the chat. Like, I don't know what impact we could have today. I hope 5 years from now, we can make sure that the new norm for American policy is not just lip service to fundamental human rights, but actually very much rooting our policy in fundamental human rights and realizing that those fundamental human rights are actually what can lead the world to a safer place at this particular moment. We're in a new moment that's the post-American empire. We're in a multipolar world. That's why America was trying to broker this deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel called normalization, in part because 6 months ago, China stepped up in a way that it's rarely stepped up and brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so now we're trenching ourselves back to this hard power model. And what we're saying is, no, actually, there is a different way forward. Human rights is human security, and we've got to be serious about that. And all of us on this call have that ability and that responsibility to cast this new vision. It's just going to take some time.
I appreciate, Greg, the way that you're orienting us to a larger time frame. It's, frankly, it's a discouraging weekend for all of us here, right? We're really grieving, and we know the work isn't done. We continue to show up. We're here in this call with you all, frankly, because we believe that now more than ever, we have to lean in. we have to keep working and declaring a new way as possible, a bigger vision for our world in which all of us can flourish side by side together, collectively, whatever it may look like. It is possible. And so we root to that vision, even as it takes us a long time. Sarah, I want to come to you next. It can be really easy in this moment to succumb to these binaries of good and evil, of everyone on the other side from me is a monster. How do we, in the way that we speak as peacemakers, reject that and offer a bigger vision? And how do we do so in ways that don't compare or equivocate suffering or trauma?
Yeah, not an easy question, and not one that we on this call have the answer to, right? We are practitioners figuring this out along with the rest of you. But what I wanted to point to here is one of our practices of peacemaking, that's nonviolence. And this was a word that came up for me a lot this weekend as I was sitting and watching horrific, unjustifiable violence unfold, knowing that on Friday before this happened, there was also a horrific, unjust, violent reality. And that's not trying to equate the two. It's not trying to say they cancel out. But I was thinking about what in this moment then are we called to do as peacemakers to revert away from these binaries of good versus evil. And I'd offer up Dr. King's definition of nonviolence, that nonviolence is creative and clear resistance to injustice. So how do we respond as peacemakers nonviolently in this moment, right? Today, for the next weeks to come and the months to come, we can creatively and clearly resist injustice and shifting away from that comparison of suffering and trauma, right? Watching the death tolls climb of Israelis and Palestinians has been heartbreaking. One number doesn't cancel out another number. One amount of death and destruction does not justify another amount of death and destruction. And I think when we creatively and clearly resist any example of injustice, we're able to move away from that whataboutism or that comparison to say, no, wherever injustice crops up, there I need to do my work and stand against it, speak out against it, work for flourishing, work for justice as preconditions that are necessary for peace. So, right, not falling into that trap of us versus them from fear, good versus evil, really thinking about how do we creatively and clearly resist injustice so we can be nonviolent actors and peacemakers during this time of heightened violence, but also hopefully once we move forward to really resist the violence that existed before. We've talked about, Greg was just saying, this doesn't come out of a vacuum. The conditions and experiences of Israelis and Palestinians before this weren't peaceful, weren't just, weren't actually secure, as this weekend has shown. So I think we have opportunity to clearly and creatively resist where we can. And that, to me, is the only way we get away from these binaries of good versus evil and us versus them.
That's so powerful, Sarah. Thank you for that. And I was reminded of a poem as you shared that maybe I'll share just quickly. It's very short, talking about the significance of each human life lost and how we can't just move beyond, hearing a number of a tally and that be that, or compare it to a different number. And it's, maybe I'll just share a link in the chat or after this call in the podcast notes. It's called The Pedagogy of Conflict by Padre Gotuma, who's a poet from Northern Ireland, who wrote about the loss of lives that he experienced and witnessed across the world, but also in his life as someone from a region of conflict. Feel free to look it up, folks. But before we transition to audience questions, Greg, I want to ask you this final question. What does it look like to build a peacemaking movement right now? What can we do in our communities to support mutual flourishing, a transformation of the underlying structural realities, and also care for our friends who are hurting and grieving? What does it look like for us to own our agency and responsibility right now?
That's a big question, and I honestly don't have all the answers to it. I'm in this with you, just as all of us on the Telos team are. We're trying to learn. We believe the world does not have to be this way, and we can model a different way, and we're learning together. October 7th made it that much more difficult. What I will say are a couple things. First, always center the humanity and compassion. If your initial reaction to something like Saturday, knowing all that, I don't want to criticize anyone for their reactions, but I'm just saying, checking in with yourself, if you don't have compassion for people who are suffering something intolerable, I would ask you, particularly if you're living here in the States, hey, what's going on there? Because this is not, we're not headed to a good place if we're losing our ability to understand just how horrific these things are. But if you're just first learning about Palestinians today and are surprised and say, wait, I don't think that's true. When you hear me say things that Palestinians have been suffering horrors every single day for decades, not only living under an unjust system in which they are controlled. Remember, most Gazans come from what is today Israel. 80% are refugees or their descendants from Israel. Gaza in 1948 had its population literally triple in a space of a few months, 80,000 to 250,000, with all of these refugees who are kicked out, fled, expelled from their homes because of who they were, and never allowed to return. And suddenly Gaza had to, absorb all of these people. And so much there. That means there's so much that you need to learn. If you don't have compassion for Palestinians, or if you're like, oh, well, Palestinians are just being bombed again, they're just like you and me. They are you and me. That's the illusion or the disillusion of this reality, that somehow we are actually separated from one another. When we are connected, we are intertwined with one another. So the first step, I think, is fundamentally to recognizing that and then acting on that and showing up, being present in ways big and small for the people that you care about and the people that you know and the people that you want to support. So just reaching out, not expecting a response from Palestinian Israeli friends who are suffering right now, or from Jewish or Arab friends here in America who are also suffering right now. Figuring out how to use your resources, whether that's your voice or your money, to support people suffering right now, and so many more people, tens of thousands of people likely in the coming year will die, and hundreds and thousands displaced and suffering in extraordinary ways. And so what I want you to do is to always center that. The second thing is something that we did, which was incredibly helpful to me personally, is we tried to consolidate our learnings about peacemaking. What are the frames, the postures, and what are the things that we can do into a set of learnings that apply not just in Israel, Palestine, but here in our own communities, in our personal lives, everywhere. Maybe they're not perfect, but I think they have so much insight. They're called the principles and practices of peacemaking. You'll have many opportunities to dive into this in detail. Sarah mentioned one, which is nonviolence, and this idea that, if we're trying to build a more just world, it doesn't mean, well, how we do that is really critical. And nonviolence doesn't mean sitting on the sidelines and just sitting down and doing nothing. It means creative, active resistance against injustice. There are other principles that I think you will find so helpful and practices in this moment and going forward. So I would encourage you to enter that conversation with us as we build this multi-generational movement to address a multi-generational harm.
Folks, we're inviting you to lean in now more than ever. We need your support because we can't do this alone, right? This work of transforming these underlying structures in a culture that says it's okay when people suffer. We need a movement to transform them, folks. We need folks from all kinds of communities across lines of difference to join us and stand together in one united voice and say this future of mutual flourishing is possible. So we invite you to join us in declaring that. And we're going to offer a couple of follow-up ways for you, as Greg is mentioning, to continue to learn, to continue to join forces with other folks who believe in this vision too. And we'll follow up with a number of those links and ways to engage in our show notes, as well as a follow-up email for those of you who registered for this call. I want to save a couple minutes for us to answer your questions. As I mentioned earlier, you can add your questions to the chat on your screen. We are noting those, and we'll get to as many as we can, and we will hopefully wrap up by at the hour mark. But I want to start with one question, particularly for Sarah, which is, how do I share and speak in a nuanced way when posting on social media? This person used the phrase, it's complicated, but was canceled in their terms when they were trying to offer some nuance. So how can they respond and show compassion and understanding while also not distracting from some of the bigger questions?
Yeah, I saw this question in the chat and it really resonates with what I've been feeling and struggling with this weekend. One of the films I've seen about Israel Palestine, I can't think which one at the moment, has a character that says, "What I believe no longer fits conveniently on a bumper sticker." And I think that that's what's so hard about this, right? How do you nuance your care for humanity, your grief, your desire for liberation for everyone, when you have 50 characters, a small slide or tweet? But I think what I have tried to lean into is, rather than just staying with it's complicated, naming why it's complicated for me, right? I care about Israeli and Palestinian lives. I care about justice and peace for Israelis and Palestinians. Naming why you care, what you care about, what you do stand for, to me puts you in a forward-footed position rather than trying to respond what you disagree with about someone else. I haven't posted anything on my own social media. I'll own up to that. I'm scared of this too. I'm scared of being canceled for not hitting the exact balance of nuance right. But I've been reaching out to friends in direct messages and called a couple people who've posted things that I think don't align with their values and I find morally reprehensible from both sides. So responding, right? Feeling confident in the values you hold: compassion, justice, love, human rights, dignity. If you feel good about what you believe and are saying, not everyone's going to like what you're saying. Hopefully it's not that everyone hates you, but right, we've gotten critique for what we've put out from folks from both sides of the aisle. Everyone isn't going to be happy with what you're saying. On the point about, right, like critiquing, are you actually committed to liberation? I've struggled with that too, right, this week. And I come back to, what are we doing in quote unquote times of peace that we know aren't peaceful? But where are those same folks? Where am I acting for liberation for everyone in times where this isn't a news headline? And just trusting, right, that I'm doing what I can for liberation, for peace and justice. And if folks don't see that, not to be flippant, but that's not my problem. Right? It's been hard to find community. I'm grateful this community for folks who've chosen to tune in and to hear about a different way of engaging that tries to push back against the binaries. But it's really hard. I don't know if any of that was helpful, but I'll just say with you, it's really hard.
It is. I want to jump in quickly here because this is such an important question. A few things. One is that we cannot expect to have the most nuanced conversations on social media, especially at moments like this. I'm not saying don't post on social media, but there are lots of folks writing articles, sharing videos that I think are important. If you do post on social media, you can do some of that. But really, if we're thinking long-term movement building, a lot of this is going to come off with conversations in our communities and whatnot, and really developing relationships with people. Two, I want you to know that what you say and what you experience has impact. So when you have these difficult interactions with people, trust me, I grew up Palestinian in America. Like I've seen a lot in my lifetime, and sometimes you have heated conversations. This is so much calmer than what so many of our friends are experiencing. It doesn't even compare right now. Keep that in mind. But at the same time, sometimes you plant seeds, and we've seen massive evolutions on all sorts of issues in our lifetimes. And what happened is that people spoke up, and they received sometimes often vitriolic responses to speaking up. But being part of the conversation, humbly sharing your truths, is important. Third, one of the important practices that I want to highlight here, I do want people to speak up. I don't want to lose that point, but I do think it's important. The first practice of 6 practices of peacemaking is listen to understand. Paul Tillich once said, love's first act is to listen. And often a lot of people in our lives, they have a lot to share and they don't know very much. I see this on social media. I saw this with a friend last night who really didn't know anything about the history of Gaza and was just like, okay, this is what I think I know, whatever, like this is what should happen. It was something really horrible. And what I want to say is that, like, one of the best ways to communicate with people is to first deeply listen and to reflect back what you hear them saying and what they're passionate about. And that will help build stronger relationships so that you can start sharing what you know to be true and these other perspectives that they're not going to receive because they don't see that there is a possibility of seeing it. Finally, things will evolve and change. We're at a heightened moment right now, and we will be for some time, but people are going to start questioning as they have before, because a lot of the narratives that we're receiving, they feel easy, they feel right, but we know they don't lead us to a good result. In fact, they've led us exactly where we got to today.
That's a helpful word, Greg. I appreciate that. I know we're getting a lot of comments, and we won't be able to answer all of them, so I apologize. But feel free to reach out to us on social media and share those comments there, and we can hopefully answer them in the coming days through the posts that we share and the ways that we engage. Very quickly, I want to invite my colleagues to share with us some potential next steps. How can folks engage with our work? Where can they go? What can they do right now? Carolyn, would you share with us a couple of ways that folks can respond?
Absolutely. So first of all, we have a newsletter that comes out. You can sign up. There's a link in the show notes. Socials will also be linked in the show notes. And our colleagues have developed this amazing resource that gives you some historical context on key dates and history on how did we get here. And you can access that through Allison, which is an online course, website platform. And so that's available on there. And Sarah can tell us a little bit about the Learning Corps.
Yeah, we also have a community called the Telos Learning Corps. We don't always have conversations like this with this many people, but each month we gather as peacemakers who are committed to continue learning, but then also figuring out how to turn that learning into action. So I invite you to sign up for our Learning Corps. We touch on different topics that get at the violent situation behind these escalations or these moments of heightened violence. So we'd love to see you there. There's more room for questions and conversations. I know we didn't get to all the questions today. They're all important. Would love to continue the conversation with you all. So if you're looking for a community like this, where we try and walk a line that is sometimes lonely, but incredibly powerful and we think effective, we invite you to come join us.
Dave, jump in here.
Yeah. Thank you. This has been an incredibly powerful conversation. And as one who mostly just sat back and listened, I just want to appreciate and say my level of appreciation to the three of you who sort of navigated these very challenging topics in a way that is very honoring to our methodology and to our approach. And our hope is that you got a glimpse of what Telos is about, how we navigate these very difficult conversations. And we hope that you would continue to lean in. And one of the ways that you can do that is by supporting our work in a financial way. Right now on our website, there's a Donate Now button. And in that space, you can give to the Peacemakers Fund. And the Peacemakers Fund is a fund that we've established that we will be using to help our partners on the ground in Israel, Palestine rebuild. We also would encourage you to continue to support the everyday work of Telos to help us navigate these coming months that will be very challenging for us, as travel now will be near impossible in the region. There are other things that we can and should be and will be doing to help navigate these next few months. So we need your help in that as well. So I've added a link in the chat there if you want, but also you can just go to our website and there's a donate button there at the top right-hand corner. We really would appreciate all of your support.
Thanks, Dave. And just as a reminder for those who are listening after the fact, that all those links are in the show notes. You can find those there. I'm reminded of Mother Teresa's quote as we've had this conversation. She says, "If we have no peace, it is because we have forgotten we belong to each other. If we have no peace because we see an enemy in our neighbor, we've forgotten that we belong to them." Folks, we need each other across the world. We need each other on this call. All of you who are listening in, both live and after the fact, we belong to each other. And the more that we see our futures intertwined, the more that we see our flourishing tied into your flourishing, the more we will be able to cast a vision that helps us transform this kind of violence, both physical and structural, into lasting, just peace. So we need you. We need each other. We are here for you. We are going to continue to speak up, speak loudly and boldly about what's going on and how we can pursue mutual flourishing for everyone. So thanks for joining us today. Stay tuned in, and we'll see you next time.